Thank you for joining us, Andrew Knight. It's a pleasure to have you here and discuss about the potential of improving built environment with new technologies and new ways of doing things. It's always been a pleasure to discuss with people that have a very wide understanding, but also in-depth understanding of what's happening in the industry, what's happening in the build profession. And not only build profession, but also what are the implications to the natural environment, in some cases even to public health. So we're talking about the convergence of those multiple technologies, satellites, quantum computing, sensors, geospatial data. What do you think that the future will show us in the next years as a result of those combinations of technologies?
Well, I think for me, what fascinates me is how historically, and to a large extent still, the built and natural environment has been very short of data. I think it's perhaps a cliche to talk about it in that sense, but we still, although there have been huge advances, we don't have, or haven't until perhaps recently, had enough data to plan, to analyze, to manage places and cities. And I think particularly now with such drivers now, such imperatives around net zero and kind of the social value, the social economic ways we want to value cities, I think we have a huge opportunity now because, as I say, historically, we've lacked data. And now we have a variety of data sources. We now have a convergence of technology in terms of the ability to crunch and analyze big data sources. Because some of these data sources, if we look at even buildings, even the output of some of the building management systems. And if we scale that up to larger parts of a city, connected buildings, a city itself, we have huge challenges potentially with absorbing and analyzing that data. But we now have the technologies. We have the ability to use satellites to identify both heat islands in a city, for example, or indeed buildings that are performing very badly from a kind of thermal perspective and target intervention. So I think for me, the good news is that we've reached a point where whilst we have huge challenges, we now have the technology there. We now have potentially quantum computing to do some very, very heavy hitting analysis. And we have the data sets becoming available now to really address some of the huge problems we have.
That's a really good insight. You mentioned thermal imagery. I know that there are some satellites that are about to be launched looking at high resolution data. And we also have satellites that can capture video right now with quite a high precision. So it's really interesting to see how those kind of combinations of both observation, high definition observation with multispectral, with thermal imagery, even with radar, when combined with AI, and with the emergence of the Metaverse. We had a good discussion about the Metaverse a few episodes ago, how those things can produce value for the built environment. I know that there's always this question of, we have accelerated technology, but when it's about adoption, sometimes there are barriers. And I know from my experience that those barriers can come from usability, so that interface can be quite complex and quite sophisticated, and it requires a lot of training. Sometimes it might be because of the budget or the lack of data, and sometimes it might be something that along the lines of the regulations, procedures that need to be checked before using it. What do you think are the biggest barriers in adopting new technologies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because, in fact, we did a survey of all our tech partners like yourselves before Christmas, and one of the questions we posed was specifically around barriers, albeit perhaps from the perspective of people who are selling into to various kinds of organizations that need to digitize in the built environment. And I guess a number of themes came up, one of which I think, ironically, is people. There is still resistance to change. There is still a lack of certain skills. There is still, I think, a fear of changing to some degree of inertia within organizations. But I think if we look at the technical side, I think for me the optimistic piece is that technology is becoming easier to use in terms of the visualization. So I think it's important that we make sure the technology is, and it's become a cliche to say this, but it is easy to use and intuitive. And there certainly are financial limits, particularly now with the macroeconomic environment, but even before the recent changes in the backdrop, if I think particularly of perhaps government bodies who are typically do have limits to expenditure, and indeed private bodies, you need to understand how can we make a business case here? How can we show a return on investment? And I think, once again, taking an optimistic perspective here, I think many organizations realize this kind of agile sprint approach where you solve one problem and then move to the next one. And so you have that incremental success. So rather than saying, let's digitize this entire environment, let's use technology to fix every problem, let's pick them off one by one, show the return on investment, get the adoption, get the change management piece done, get the people on board with the value that's coming out of this technology. So I think I can be optimistic. There are barriers there, financial, people, and I think it does require a lot of change of mindset. And I think also, and we may touch on it later, that there can sometimes be a reticence that technology, and this is a very old story, various waves of technological advancement, is going to replace people's jobs. And I think, for me, in so many instances, we see a really positive picture there of particularly things like AI, machine learning, augmenting what people do, not replacing them, but taking away so much of the automation, the data gathering, some of the analytics that realistically human beings just can't do if we think of big data sets, and actually freeing up professionals in the built and natural environment to really add value and to spend less time with that automation process piece that can be automated and really apply their judgment, their expertise. So I remain very optimistic that I think adoption will be happening at a pace. And whilst there are barriers, they're probably quite traditional barriers that most kind of sectors have seen when they first try and digitize. And I'm sure the built environment can take advantage of that learning from other sectors. And I guess my last comment would be a behavioral change around sharing data. I think in my perception, the built and natural environment has been reticent about sharing data sets. And there are certainly governance issues and ethical issues we need to understand in that area, but the power of sharing data sets is enormous. If you have a partial view of a city or a region or a building, you don't have the full picture. You can't understand those scales of aggregation of data that the power the analytics give. So I think one thing I would say is the sector needs to understand how to govern and share, and dare I say, standardize data to make sure we can share more of it.
Exactly. And on the subject of standards, I think it's quite important when we are training AI companions that can support people in their work to have that in the standardized way that is not only to make software engineers and data scientists' life easier, but to be able to track the quality of that AI model. We see what's happening right now with text-to-text AI generators, text to objects, text to images, and very often the idea of licensing, the quality of data that was used for training is often questioned. And if creative work has some sort of flexibility in that kind of licensing and the outputs, when it's about the built environment and decisions affecting millions of people in some cases, we need to be very careful of what the AI takes as information and how the model can be reliable in making decisions and transforming that in some cases to regulations, to standards, to plans, strategies, and even actual buildings and neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point, and I think people understandably are perhaps slightly concerned about AI and it becoming a kind of a black box, to use the phrase. And I think there is a real point here about the concept of explainability, which is not really a proper word, but it's that sense of, can we understand correctly within reason how the models are working? And some are obviously very, very complex. And I guess if we balance that against the risk, if we do have a high-risk situation like facial recognition, for example, or as you say, decisions that impact people in a really significant way, I think AI should be explainable. We need to understand how was it trained, what kind of data was used to train it, and indeed have a proper governance around the development, calibration, operation of these models. Because as we've seen in certain jurisdictions already, and we're particularly kind of concerned about the kind of valuation process, which often now is used using machine learning or certainly quite complex linear regression and other statistical approaches, that we've seen bias creeping in, whether that's racial or based on other demographics. So it's really important that we do govern AI. And it's not, I think, a sense that humans have to necessarily second guess the decisions that AI make, because AI will actually take bias out of certain decisions, which I think is good. But I think we must have a clear understanding that as well as having technically astute people writing these models, we need professionals in the built environment understanding, being part of the process of development, governance, and operation of these, and that we can, in extremis, explain the kind of decisions that AI is making on our behalf.
So in this world with accelerating technologies, including AI, we see that the progress AI made in the last 6 months. What is the role of humans in this, especially that the human expertise can differentiate from AI in a number of ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a profoundly interesting topic, not just for the built-in natural environment, but our whole relationship as human beings with what we now see fairly ubiquitous use of AI in its various forms. I guess it doesn't help that AI is such a wide-ranging term in terms of the capabilities, on the sense that if you look at the kind of risks involved and the way it's used, I think we're all fairly comfortable with Netflix suggesting what we might want to watch next in terms of a movie, not just based on what we've seen, but the kind of emotional triggers that a certain movie might have. But obviously at the other extreme, we have AI making decisions about the value of properties or lending decisions, and obviously within the built environment, many decisions that might affect planning or the way we run buildings that directly affect us. I remain an optimist in the sense I think there's been a real realization that the sense of AI replacing human beings, I think, is now turning into a much more positive message of AI augmenting what humans do best. And I think we have to realize there are certain areas where AI will do things that humans simply are not capable of doing. If we think of big data, the data sets there, if we just think of the volume, the velocity, the variability of those data sets, and the need to take decisions very quickly on that data set, there are situations where we will have to rely on AI to make those decisions for us. Conversely, that there's a lot of areas where AI, for all its power, will be best used in automating quite prosaic tasks that will free up individuals, not just in the built environment, but in other sectors, to really add more value, to actually use their expertise. I think we can all recollect times when we've done things that are fairly tedious in terms of data collection or parts of the jobs we do. And if that can be taken away from us in a way that we can trust and still verify the output, we can then really use our judgment. And I think we've seen in a number of areas where a combination of AI with human input is the most powerful. I read an article particularly about, it's a very well repeated example of teaching an AI approach to play the game Go. But they did find actually the best combination was a master Go player and the AI. Similarly, in medical situations, that they've proven that actually, once again, looking at cancer scans, that combination of the AI and the expert is that most powerful combination. So I remain very positive that in this kind of combination of AI and human judgment, we can have the best of both worlds. I think what's important is that we do make sure that the humans are not only working with the output of AI and not necessarily overruling it, but that they're part of that governance and development process, that operational oversight, to make sure that the kind of training material that's used, for instance, in the machine learning model, is appropriate, and they understand that bias isn't being built in from day one, and that they, look out for bias creep. So I think it's a real mix here where humans are part of the process of developing and managing and using AI. They shouldn't necessarily override a decision. I mean, you could think of an example where even in the built environment, you might be using AI for recruitment, and you wouldn't want to necessarily put the bias back into the recruitment process that your AI engine has very cleverly and been trained to take out. So it's not a case of overruling AI, but I think having humans in the loop, as part of that loop at various stages, to make sure they're working hand in hand with AI. So I think I'm really positive. I think really we've seen this kind of emergence of this sense that this is not about replacing human beings. It's ironically about really taking some of the really kind of tedious, repetitive tasks away. It's about enabling AI to take decisions on scale and volume of data that we simply can't interpret, but it's still having humans ultimately responsible for the way these tools are used and really adding value, because I think we can get great value. And we think particularly of the built-in natural environment, some of the data sets are huge. We can't process that as humans. We need help, but we still need to have that human involved to make judgments and perhaps ultimately to take responsibility.
Absolutely. I think one main advantage of the AI will open the possibility of people that are not technical in a certain sector, or they don't know a lot about data processing or a specific specialization. Let's say, take for instance, agriculture or food production. You don't have the regular farmer knowing about how we're using satellite information, multispectral imagery, and then combining that, I don't know, with market dynamics to see what is the most viable crop to grow. But an AI can combine that data and then can assist the farmer, and the farmer can make the decision based on the experience or consult with an agronomist. And the same with city planning. City planning is extremely complex process, and there is a lot of data that can be collected and analyzed. But sometimes some outcomes or some policies with AI can be tested. We can see if there is any effect of that policy and if there are any spatial correlation at all based on those developments, aspirations, or policies. And if we're thinking about in some areas, climate emergency has been declared and added in the policy, or there are certain climate targets, and how we measure them in a consistent way is quite important. And that's why one of the things we're doing is we are thinking about our tools as companions for placemakers. So we are trying not to replace the human intensive work, so things such as engagements or discovering new things or finding hidden insights. Those kind of human intuitions are actually quite important and valuable, but we're trying to replace, as you mentioned, that tedious work, and also reveal potential patterns and potential causation links between different environmental, build, and human factors. So I agree with you. I think humans and AI can be really good collaborators. And one of the things I built together with the team back in 2015, it was this vision called planetary urbanism. We called it symbiotic urban intelligence. And it was about combining sensors with satellites, creating those kind of insights and potential resources that can be unlocked, and then putting that in an interfacing that can be called now part of the Metaverse. It can be in virtual reality, augmented reality, or via a device. So those insights can be communicated in a conversational way. And then when it's about decision making, that should be most of the times up to the humans, because they need to take responsibility on the decision, and they need to always question the reliability of the models, of the data sets used, and the approaches used.
I agree, and I think professionals in every sector, but particularly obviously the built environment, they need to retain that professional skepticism. They do need to challenge the data to make sure they understand the provenance. How is it collected? The methodology, can they rely on it? Is there some kind of calibration where they can see that it's constantly being validated in that way? So I think that's why professionals will be so important, because they will have all this data, they'll have all the analytics, as you say, they'll have the ability to have patterns and, as you say, levels of causation, that there are so many moving variables, it would be impossible for a human to judge. So, as I say, I remain very positive now that, as you say, AI can be seen as a companion, an assistant to professionals across the sector.
There are many discussions exploring how technology evolved in the last years and became more and more miniaturized. And one of the thoughts I had was, as technology became lighter and lighter in our hands, in some cases can become heavier and heavier in our heads. So there's also some interesting research showing that if we're using certain devices or social media that are using some AI calibrations, it can reduce our motivation to do other things, or it can get us in a cycle, a dopamine cycle, which we think we are achieving something, but we're not achieving actually anything. And in the same time, we have the opportunity with actually making change using tech. So one of the ideas is how to make technology intuitive and actionable, while making sure that it's augmenting our capacity to make good decisions without hijacking our attention or our motivation.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, that, isn't it? Because, as you say, that dopamine rush, as we all check our smart devices on an incredibly frequent basis, is difficult, because you can get sucked into technology. You can get sucked into the wealth of information. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you did a degree, you had to go to something called a library, to look up information, and it was a very manual world in that sense. And we are spoilt in the fact that we have so much information, so much power at our fingertips. And as you say, there is a danger that we forget the output, the outcome that we're actually aiming for. And if we move away from the kind of consumer individual with their smartphone into the kind of work setting of decision making and analytics and responsible decision making, we do need to balance that seductive nature of technology with the day job, with the outcomes here. And I guess for me, it's around understanding that clear laser focus on particularly some of these existential issues we are facing now around building sustainable cities, placemaking, the effects of the pandemic, and the fact that we're changing the way we work, the impacts that are being felt in health services, for example, and some of the kind of the downsides, obviously many downsides of the pandemic. And if we think of particularly emissions and net zero, and we'll probably talk about that in a minute, we really have got some incredibly important things to deal with here. So we need to make sure that tech provides, as you say, intuitive information in a way that actually doesn't suck us in. And perhaps this is a warning about perhaps too much immersive technology. We obviously see the benefits of virtual reality, augmented reality, the metaverse, whatever the shape of that will be. But we need to remember that we live in a real world, and we need to use the technology and almost turn it off at occasions and say, okay, let's go back to a human-centric meeting perhaps and say, okay, we've got these inputs, we've got the technology, perhaps we have a screen up there that's giving us this dashboard, but we have some decisions here to make. We have to think about the outcomes, our responsibilities to our stakeholders, what we're actually paid to do. And so I've always believed that technology shouldn't be an end in itself. It's a tool, and it can be seductive, it can be exciting to use, and we're all very, very, very well enabled now with tech, but we must keep going back to what are the outcomes. And I think what's useful here is perhaps, as well as these existential threats around the climate, this sense of social value and social outcomes, and the fact the built environment is where we work, we live, we play, we go to get healed. And we've got to keep thinking, what are the impacts? What are we actually trying to do here? And yes, what tools do I have at my disposal? Let's say those tools should be in the same way that we expect the apps on our smartphone to be intuitive and easy to use, whether it's Google Maps or my banking app or whatever it may be. Technology in the workplace has often, I think, fallen behind the kind of usability we see in our personal lives. If we think of the ease of use of some of the big consumer websites, they're much easier to use. I remember at work being taught to use the system to book rooms. I had to go on a training course, and I thought, well, I've never been on a course to buy from Amazon. So I think we're missing something here in terms of the UX design there. So I think there's certainly a role for technologists to make sure that their interfaces are incredibly intuitive. And we need to think about the kind of the fact that people also have different learning styles. Some people want to see lots of numbers and statistics. Others want to see more visual output. So I think we need a mix of outputs potentially with some data points. It isn't just all about visual. Some people will prefer a more kind of almost spreadsheet type view of the world. So I think we need to think about multiple ways of accessing the data. We do need to think about visualization. If we think of planning and placemaking, by definition, these are visual spaces. We need to be able to walk around them and understand them and model the effects of decisions we might make. That's one of the powers, I think, of what we have now with big data and AI, is that kind of multiple Monte Carlo where we can play around with lots of different variations. What if we put the railway station there? What will that affect in terms of traffic flows and pedestrian flows and an impact on the broader environment? What will it look like if we build it 10 or 20 stories high? How will that affect the shade and the ability to put PV cells on other roofs? So there's lots of ways we can play around visually, but it's how do we as humans almost step back from the technology and the data and then say, okay, as part of the technology, part of the output, let's make decisions, let's be responsible. So I think it's like so much of this, it comes back to a human challenge of how do we kind of stop the tech and go back to, right, let's talk to the stakeholders, let's understand and reframe again and refocus on the outcomes we're actually producing here.
Yes, and this is a really important point. In developing tech, I observe in many cases some technologies have very convoluted and complicated interface that requires a lot of explanation and training. But I think one of the most successful tools can use a lot of neuroscience insight. So the idea that the front end, the interface, is as important as the back end because it bridges the gap between intuition to action. Like understanding what's happening there, what that means, what's the meaning in terms of the insights, and then how people can take action based on that, and how trustworthy is that scenario planner or that map or that visualization. I think this is especially important in the context of the UK. If we're looking at the planning white paper, putting more emphasis on digital and machine readable data sets. Traditionally, there were a lot of plans, and there still are many local plans and a technical evidence base that is using a lot of text and tables, few maps, sometimes done by a GIS officer, but by bridging the gap between capability of planners to understand advanced insight in an intuitive way and presenting them interactively, it will probably open more opportunities, not only to have plans that look fun and exciting or legible and accessible to other people, but also plans and ideas that can be combined with other departments, other sectors. If we're talking about surveyors, if we're talking about architects, developers, but also creatives and third sector coming in, having those things integrated in interconnected platforms that can bring probably even bring faster outcomes in terms of development at a better quality, because we'll have the chance to get more input from multiple people.
Yeah, I think you raise an incredibly important use case there, that whole kind of planning process, planning and development, because I think we clearly want the planning process in the UK to move more quickly, but not at the risk of damaging outcomes and not having the proper stakeholder engagement. And I think it's a great example where, as you say, clearly the kind of plumbing of data is really important, that we have standards and the data can flow and we can format it and present it. But that kind of UX, to use the jargon, that kind of user interface is incredibly important in that planning process, because yes, there's many professionals involved, but ultimately it's the people who live in that area who will be impacted by what that development will be, who really have to have very, very human accessible information that is, hyper intuitive, that is for lay people who simply say, you want to build this development, I want to understand the impact. What will it impact in terms of light and noise and impact on local travel and impact on the software infrastructure? Can you show me how we're going to work with GPs and have enough social services available in that sense? And so it's about making sure that information is presented in not a patronizingly simple way, but a way that a whole range of stakeholders will have to consume, who don't want to be thinking about the technology. They're just thinking about the social impact on them.
I think one of the things that companies like Adobe and Autodesk done quite right was introducing workspaces, so adapting the interface based on the user. So for instance, in Adobe, you have an interface for a graphic designer or another interface for a photo editor. And being inspired by that, what we've done lately actually was we're doing a lot of interactive analytic interfaces and decision intelligence with the geospatial component. And more recently, what we thought about was we should not have an interface that is necessarily understood by everyone, but we should have a workspace for each type of user group. So let's say if it's a public health app, you want to understand environmental factors affecting public health, you should have an interface for the general public with very simple terms, nothing technical, so they can understand what is the impact for a certain health condition, for instance. But we also have a different interface for a general practitioner or a health specialist, which puts that information in technical terms that they can include in their reports, or they can have an understanding how they can enhance their diagnostic and treatment process. And then we also need another interface for planners, designers, surveyors, decision makers, where the analytics are not enough. We need to add layers about, for instance, planning constraints. And DLAC done a great job of providing open planning data layers now. So by being able to plug in those via API, you have a trusted source of information showing the kind of constraints and the situation out there, combining with other government agencies and departments' data such as Ordnance Survey, and then coming with the analytics that can be tested. And then when you have an inspection or consultation, you can actually demonstrate how those things are coming together and what was the data behind it, where is that coming from, how it was processed, and made in a way that can be actually used So that's quite an important aspect.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, that's a great example where you have that multi-layer potentially, where you'll be overlaying, as you say, planning constraints, flood risk, title information. That's a very good example, I think, of where very clever, simple layering of information could be very complex for one stakeholder, or could be quite simple for another. It could just be simply, well, here's the building, this is what it looks like in your space, and you could overlay those other things. I mean, I think potentially you talked about interfaces for different job roles. I mean, you could wonder whether potentially if you look at the kind of neuro-linguistic programming aspects of the way different individuals react to data, you could imagine almost people tailoring their own experience to the way they like to absorb information, whether it's more visual, whether they like to see it in a more, numeric way, or they might even want an audio description. They might just want a more verbal way of explaining a particular development. So I think we need to think potentially of that ability to really, really customize the way people can access information to that very kind of personal level.
So in the age of artificial intelligence, of emerging quantum computing, maybe soon enough, viable fusion energy, satellites, sensors, what is the role of the professional and technological standards, especially from the perspective of the wonderful things RICS is doing, and also in the context of emerging UK net zero building standards, and what are the expectation of professional standards in this changing climate right now?
Indeed, I mean, for me, I guess it's a recognition and an awareness that actually, despite all this data and technology, we still live in a real world where we need professional standards. If we think of the conduct side of things, we still expect professionalism, accountability, liability to be taken on, responsibility, issues like conflicts of interest. So, whilst we can get very excited by the data, the tools, the technology, we're ultimately talking about the effects on businesses and people here, of the decisions we make, the tools that we use, the approaches we take. So for me, it's critical that we kind of almost don't move away from the understanding that we do need to have professionalism. People are making responsible decisions, should be held accountable, there should be rules of conduct. Then if we think of the technology world, we need standards more than ever because of the dreaded words of interoperability. We have lots of data sets that are currently siloed, that don't talk to each other, where we call the same items of data different names. So there's a real drive and importance, I think, to get some consistency around the way we allow data to flow around and be structured in a way that they can move from system to system in that dreaded phrase interoperability. So at a technical level, I think we need, across the built-in natural environment, some real technical standards on the way data is shaped and formed and governed. We need standards, as we've discussed, around the way AI is managed and governed. So we do need those technical standards. If we're going to get information coming out of sensors and satellites, eventually that has to become into a machine-readable form that can flow around, and that various products and systems can interpret that and read them in, because we want to continue to have innovation and creativity with lots of people bringing products into the market. But what we don't want is lots of data silos being built, lots of walled gardens where we can't extract the data from one to the next. And I guess at a very simplistic way, we kind of need that open banking approach where data can move around and be accessed in that ethically controlled way. So technically, we need those standards. And I think particularly if we look at something as prosaic as buildings, the industry struggles to share information on buildings. It struggles to share information on emissions and all these kind of issues as you discussed around the kind of net zero building standard. We need to agree on what we call the measurements of building. We need to agree on the way we measure emissions and how we calculate emissions. We need to agree on the way we call different building materials to understand how we can manage that circularity of materials. So there's a lot of work where I think what is understandably a very fragmented sector, if we think of the number of market participants in the built environment, it is quite challenging. But those participants need to recognize that there's a huge societal and indeed commercial imperative to share data in a sensible way, to have common standards, to have common formats, and at the same time not give the world of data a kind of a get out of jail card for professional standards. So from an RICS perspective, if we think particularly around ESG, that's a real, perhaps a mess is too strong a word, but there's lots of metrics out there. It's quite a confused world. And I know market participants want data on the ESG performance of their assets, and we need some standardization. We need some agreement on what the metrics are. So we do need standardization, both at that very technical kind of machine level, but also at that almost that taxonomy of what do we call things? Can we agree on what we call the various attributes, both geospatially, in terms of land, in terms of buildings, in terms of infrastructure, so we can communicate and use the same words. And I say, let's not forget conduct. Let's not forget the professionalism, the accountability. As I say, the cyber world, in my view, is not a get-out-of-jail card. It's not parallel in the sense that it has to exist within jurisdictional regulations. It has to exist within professional body regulations. So I think it's really important that we have standards. But what they should be seen as, in my view, is not a straitjacket, but a framework, a way of allowing innovation, a way of allowing continued creativity and innovation in the sector, but within a framework that allows that ability to share, analyze data, and work professionally.
Absolutely. And I think very often there is this misconception that standards are limitations. They're actually, as you mentioned, is a way to make reliable decisions, to have accountability. And for instance, in the case of ESG, very often is seen as a limitative factor or a standard, but actually what it does as the core element is aiming to de-risk a certain business process, certain developments, making things more predictable from that sense. And from a net zero perspective and sustainability perspective, it's also about improving quality of life and the value of assets. There are many interesting studies showing that the proximity to high quality environment, for instance, improves not